My guest today is Jennifer Higgie, writer, curator, and art historian. Her latest book, The Other Side, explores the lives of women artists who connected with the spirit world through their work. We're talking art, intuition, mysticism, and what it means to be an artist with a connection to unknown realms. I'm Belle Bear. This is Sacred Mechanics. I have actually been waiting months to talk to you, so I'm really excited. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
The main reason I have you here today is to discuss your book, The Other Side, which impacted my creative work in the past 6 to 12 months. And I literally inhaled the first parts of the book as an audiobook, and then I got the hard copy and I keep it nearby and I really love it. And I'm hoping that people listening today, if they haven't heard of the book, get it immediately. And if they have, they're probably going to really enjoy the juicy bits that we can get to in this book in a bit more detail with you.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
There's some really funny parts in the book where as soon as I started reading about Georgiana Horton and the dagger in her hair, I was tempted to change my whole look. I was like, this woman.
Yeah, I love the dagger in her hair. It's such a great thing because she looks like this, very respectable middle-aged Victorian lady. And then you look closer and there's this dagger poking out from her hair. It's wonderful. It's like a little signifier of her interest in more complex ways of inhabiting the world, possibly.
Yeah, and I recall that you had asked a costume designer or a designer friend if she was aware of anything historically in fashion at the time, and she couldn't find any clue of that. So that's really punk to me, and just
punk is true. Yeah, because I was thinking when I first saw it, I thought, well, maybe there was a fashion for wearing daggers in your hair in, Victorian England. And then I asked Judith Clark, who's a really amazing costume and fashion historian, and she was like, no, that's amazing. So,
yeah. Anyway, this is it's just a little physical thing I found about trying to situate myself in the time and place and what the women's lives may have been like, and then these small details that they've allowed themselves to be captured and obviously be very rarely photographed, and to bring themselves into that image was really powerful. So I think behind closed doors, women like this were really someone to be reckoned with. And we know that the way history is told, that we are just scraping through a slither of their real lives, and the work that you've done pulls it forward and just helps everyone. And I noticed in researching a bit before talking to you that this birth of the abstract movement and Kandinsky is still out there. And I just want to yell, it was Hilma. And then I went a little bit further down the rabbit hole with Besant's and Leadbeater's book, Thought Forms. And I was lucky enough to find a video on YouTube that flicks through the whole book, because I haven't held one in my hand before. And then it dawned on me how reflective of that was in Hilma's work, and how you'd mentioned it influenced her, but I didn't realize how deeply till I started really studying those images. So that was really powerful to see as well.
I mean, I think it's really interesting in terms of abstraction. I mean, the story that I was told when I was at art school in like the 80s and 90s was that, essentially Kandinsky, in terms of Western European art, was the one to invent abstraction or to come up with this idea. And he's an amazing artist, and I love his work and I love his writings on the spiritual in art. But it's such a false reading of actually what happened. And it is Hilma af Klint, but it's also Georgiana Houghton. It's also lots of women who were exploring new ways of representing the world in the 19th century. So, yeah, art history is never as simple as many of the books will lead you to believe, I think.
So I'm learning. It's incredible. It's and we will continue unraveling, obviously. I think there's a few things that in the book and potentially in all of the work that you're doing that just knock the top off some things, so we can peek a little bit further inside through this new, well, it's not a new lens, but it's a lens that's maybe getting a bit more attention in the landscape of women in art. But what I'm interested in is this crossroads of spirituality and personal belief systems and things like that, and how deeply they can invoke creativity regardless of what's going on in fashion and art and things like that. But, we'll always be seeking where that really comes from. And I think having a spotlight on artists like this, it just brings it in a little bit closer. So it's very special to me that we can run through a few ideas tonight. So you write so compellingly about artists who acted as vessels for something greater, divine, mystical, or unseen. In your view, what defines an artist as a medium?
I mean, that's a great question. And in a way, the answer, I think, is that A, it depends on your understanding of the word medium, but if you understand it as I do, as someone who is open to receiving energies sometimes they don't fully understand, or to explore images that come to them and they're not quite sure about their provenance, but they're willing to look into them, and that they're willing to explore uncharted territories. I think that in a way constitutes the artist as a medium. I mean, it's interesting. There was a lot of writing around modernism about the artist as medium. Even, Marcel Duchamp, who's sort of famous as a conceptual artist, but he said that he wrote somewhere, I think it was around, I can't remember exactly when he wrote it, but he said that he'd always seen the artist as a mediumistic being. And, I think one of the really wonderful things about art making is that it can't be reduced to a formula. It can't always be fully understood with the rational mind. And it's about trying to understand the world in ways that aren't necessarily fully explicable, except through the creative gesture or the creative act. And, I think that's why in this sort of rampantly materialist world that we live in, it's really important to honor art and artists because they're doing something that in a way can't be bought or sold. Of course, you can buy or sell paintings, but you can't buy or sell the creative act and the mysterious process that artists go through to create something.
Yeah, that's really poignant. You can't buy it and bottle it. And I know as an artist and other artists, and you would feel this too, is that sometimes it's very hard to articulate and capture what's inside coming forth as well. And I think it's through repetition and a lot of practice or setting yourself up to receive what comes forth when you're in front of the canvas or page or instrument or whatever, to put it out there. And maybe we work so hard all our lives to refine our craft so that we can articulate what's inside more clearly. I don't know if we ever quite get there. Even a master would feel the same, I'm sure, where they just are always wanting to exceed and clarify the message, which is maybe a really subjective way to look at it as well, because you can't control the message and how it's seen either. Yeah, it's a really deep pull. I really think other people will enjoy hearing, your perspective on this as we move forward. And just to roll into the next question, do you think art is inherently a form of channeling, whether conscious or not, that all artists are conduits?
I mean, I always hesitate about speaking for all artists or women or all anything, because I think that there are always exceptions to the rule. But, I think that most artists would be open to the idea that often what they create, even they don't fully understand. And that's the beauty of art too, that it's communicating something in a language that can only be understood through that language. So the only art that can be reduced to, a slogan or one line is a form of propaganda. Most great art has an element of mystery to it, I think, which would back up the idea of an artist being a channeler of sorts.
Yeah, maybe that's just the word that doesn't sit right, but it's this idea of pulling ideas through and out into a tangible medium, or a medium that can be perceived by one of the senses at least. I don't want to exclude musicians or dancers or anything like that. So just to pull out a word that I hadn't heard before that is all about this is the historical women artists you've written about in The Other Side. You'd mentioned this word somnambulist. Are they all somnambulists in varying degrees, or is this a Madame Blavatsky's term that really is only used in extreme cases? Is there varying degrees from each artist where they actually did go into trance to do the work, or not so much? What was your finding?
One thing that I think it's really important to emphasize is that in the 19th century, the word spiritual and spiritualist had many different meanings and connotations as well. And there were many different sort of manifestations of spiritualism. And somnambulism is just one of them, and I think it was used, and it's quite an old-fashioned word. You don't hear it very often now. It's to do with a sort of sleeping, waking state, somewhere that hovers in between. And it's a bit like when dreams are revealed to you, and there's a certain kind of channeling of different kinds of energies or different kinds of states of being. So, somnambulism was definitely, an important one. But the more you look into how these artists created their work, everyone had a different way of doing it, whether they had spirit guides, whether they did it through dreams or a form of automatism, which the surrealists really picked up, where you just approach a canvas or a piece of paper without any preconceived ideas of what you're going to do, and you just put down exactly what comes to you. There are, of course, psychic means of approaching creating images. Another one was mesmerism, the idea of being sort of hypnotized, an early form of hypnosis. And actually, it sort of gets divided into two different groups. In one, we just see the work that was created, and we're not quite sure what motivated it because the artist didn't leave any explanation behind. But then, actually, with an artist such as Georgiana Houghton, she left behind a wonderful autobiography, so which you can just download on Kindle, for a couple of dollars. And in this, she really outlines exactly what prompted her to make these images. She talks about her spirit guides. She talks about her Christianity as well. She was a sort of mystic Christian. And so that's really interesting because it gives you an insight into the workings of her mind. And actually, Hilma af Klint, the great Swedish artist as well, I mean, she left behind, and I'm not exaggerating, 27,000 pages of notes. And so studies and scholarship around Hilma af Klint are really sort of ongoing, and there are new discoveries all the time because people are studying these 27,000 pages of notes. But what's interesting in her notes actually is that, say, with Georgiana Houghton, she's very clear about what she does, and she doesn't have any sort of conflict about creating these extraordinary images which look like abstract pictures in the mid-19th century, very radical. But with Hilma af Klint, she often used, for example, words in her pictures that she didn't know what these words meant. They weren't Swedish. And so she is often in her notes questioning what it is she's trying to communicate or what the messages are that the spirit world is giving her. So that's all very interesting too, I think, that I think with every artist, there's going to be a different approach and a different understanding of what
Yeah.
they've given.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Wow. Yeah, that's actually really cool. I love this. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to talk about intuition and inspiration. So this isn't entirely about your book, but just your observations from your life in the art world as a creator and as one that knows many creators and has those opportunities to critique and discuss and research. How do you believe intuition features in the creative process for most people? Is there a difference for you between intuition and inspiration?
Oh, gosh, that's a good question. I've never heard that one before. I'm gonna have to think about that. I think, first of all, I think intuition is absolutely central to the creative act, and I don't think any artist, however analytical or involved in post-structuralism or in, thinking about deconstruction or anything like that, I don't think anyone could deny the role of intuition. That sometimes as an artist, when you're making something, something comes to you that you put down and you don't always know where it came from. I think inspiration is absolutely central to the creative act. The idea that something unexpected can enter your thinking. And in terms of inspiration, maybe inspiration's more conscious in that you might go to a museum to search for inspiration, that I might pop down to the National Gallery to walk around and see how other artists have made decisions about creating a picture. And so when you see how an artist who you admire has done something, you think, oh, well, maybe I could explore that as well. I could use that medium. Actually, I love it too. This is just a sideline that in art, we use mediums. What's your medium? People will say, which meaning obviously paint or photography. But I do
That's
love
so
it.
good. Yeah.
I think they're
That's
kind but
unbelievable. I've never thought of it that way.
no,
But
isn't it funny? I remember when I realized that, I went, "Oh my god, that's hilarious!" Because I was writing so much about mediums, then I went, "What's your medium?" "Oh, it's paint." But, yeah, so I think looking for inspiration can be a more sort of conscious search, maybe.
Yeah. So that when you're in that place to begin your work, that would be the inspiration and intuition sort of fusing, and then who knows what's going to come out once you combine. It's like a concoction, isn't it? So it sort of makes everything really unlimited in an individual's capacity. Just gives people a deep well to work from, I think, over a lifetime. So do you think we're in the midst of a cultural or spiritual reawakening in the art world? Is the unseen making a return, or do we still have to stay fairly hushed?
I think there are lots of answers to that question. I mean, if you look at, say, First Nations art making, I think that that's, remained powerful and central to community and cultural expression for, well, obviously in Australia for 60,000 years or more. And in First Nations cultures around the world, that's been unbroken and important and vital, in terms of how cultures understand themselves and
Yeah.
communicate, everything from traditional knowledge to map making to the
Beautiful, yeah.
riches of First
Core.
Nations art. In terms of Western art history, I think that for a long time in the 20th century, with modernism and with American critics such as Clement Greenberg, who are sort of pushing for a kind of formalism in art, and they saw ideas around, say, spirituality or religion as being very old hat and as being, part of the old systems that we have to debunk to move into a sort of pure new way of representing the world. And while some of those critics had some interesting things to say, I think that they really did art generally a disservice in the sense that they were espousing a single way of moving forward that they felt was valid, and they dismissed a lot of other ways of looking at the world. And also you see lots of mid-century art historical readings of artists such as Kandinsky or Paul Klee or Mondrian, extraordinary artists who were exploring abstraction. Now, they were all paid up members of the Theosophical Society. They were all deeply interested in spiritualism. Kandinsky even wrote the very important essay in 1912 on the spiritual in art that was proved to be very, influential on a lot of artists. But when their work was shown in the late 1930s at the Museum of Modern Art, in the first sort of big show on abstraction, their interest in spirituality was sort of brushed aside. Art historians were interested in how they were creating new ways of representing the world, but they were maybe even a bit embarrassed by the spiritual side. They didn't want to really acknowledge that. And that sort of set the tone for how curators and art historians were taught for the next few decades. You get the really important American art historian and theorist Rosalind Krauss, and she writes in the 1970s, about how the word spiritual was an embarrassment to the way that she'd been taught about art, for example. I do think that it really did suffer for a long time, for decades. But now in recent years, there's a much more pluralistic way of looking at art and art production. It's not this sort of rather narrow way that was espoused in immediate post-war art history. So, I think that, there have been really important big shows that have traveled around looking at the spiritual in art. Obviously, artists like Hilma af Klint was shown at the Guggenheim, and it's to this day, it's the most attended exhibition they've ever staged in New York at the Guggenheim. And there's been a sort of explosion of interest in the exclusions of art history, what hasn't been discussed properly, what hasn't been given its due. And spiritualism is part of that. And also the achievements of female artists and women artists, throughout art history. I mean, I went to art school for 6 years, and I was never taught that, for example, there were really extraordinary female artists in the Renaissance in Italy working really hard and, achieving a great measure of success. They weren't just marginalized, they were, central to many of the debates around, what was happening in art at that time. So anyway, I think there's a really healthy groundswell of movement around re-examining art history and seeing art history now not as something that's carved in stone, but something that's a work in progress.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole new world waiting for us, I think, as a recent student just dabbling in art history. I don't know how far we've come as far as women artists. I mean, in like contemporary art, modern art, sure, but I think just pulling back a little bit further than that. Perhaps there is not enough information and things are so deeply buried, I'm not sure. But there is a lot of work ahead to pull it through, and it is fascinating, and it is part of my inspiration as well. And just the more I learn about art history, and I think I'd mentioned this earlier in our conversation, just trying to position myself in the shoes of women at a certain time and place and what their responsibilities and role in society were, and knowing how all-consuming being an artist can be, how they found the time, did the work, documented what they could, wrote what they could. I think this is really wonderful that now it's getting read by many or put on display finally. So it's a bit of a time traveling moment for me, I think, when because we're getting sometimes more than the artwork when there's a backstory, and we know so much more now, and we can fill in the blanks because we have the internet and things like that. They're like, oh, what's that book? And she read this and did that. And just to put the pieces of the puzzle together, which is fascinating. I guess I've come into the conversation with a westernized skew because I've had the book on my mind all day, and I'm not as well versed in Indigenous art of any kind and things like that, but it'd be really great to get into that another time, just because when we talk about non-Western world art and we get into spirituality, that's where the richness resides, I think. And again, I feel like there is perhaps not enough documentation or information for a normal gallery goer or art appreciator to go in depth. And I think that's what the future will bring us, is the more people that look into it and can deliver this information and write books and publish things, that this will become enriched as well, which I do look forward to educate myself. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I that's what I found when I was writing my book. Like, I didn't start writing The Other Side from a position of authority or deep knowledge even. It was more from a position of curiosity. And, I was very clear that my book isn't encyclopedic in any way. It's a very sort of personal journey through many of these stories, and it was intertwined with a lot of stuff that I was going through at the time, and I was looking for a kind of re-enchantment after leaving a job I'd been doing for a long time. And so, yeah, I think when I was writing the book, it evolved in the writing. I would discover one artist and go, oh my God, they're amazing. And then I would read about them and they might suggest someone else who I could look at, going down these sort of rabbit holes of exploration. So, it's funny, when I got to the end of it, I thought, oh my God, this book could be 10 times longer, because there's so many artists I could be discussing that I haven't looked into, and so many different cultures I haven't looked at. And, this is just like a taste. It's a beginning, in a way, of a journey.
Yeah, well, I can tell you from a reader's perspective, I agree. When I've listened to the audiobook for the first time and it just ended, and I was like, I want more now. Like, I became actually addicted to the stories and the way the stories were told and your personal anecdotes through it. And it was really an enjoyable format, with the chapters sectioned off per artist with little crossovers, social crossovers, and what was going on sort of in the spiritual world at the time. Yeah, I think for anyone interested in any of these subjects, you can't get enough of it. And it sounds like there's a lot more material to come forth, I'm sure, and I hope. What role do dreams or altered states of consciousness play in your own creative life?
I mean, I've always been very interested in dreams. And whenever I have a dream, I write them down. I've been doing that for years. And it's fascinating looking over them and seeing certain themes that sort of recur in dreams. I've always been very open to the idea of premonitions and dreams connecting you to things that maybe you haven't thought about in your own life. Also, I think dreams are fascinating through a kind of irrationality as well. I think it's important to remember that we're not entirely rational beings, that there are parts of ourselves that we don't understand. And I think you have to be open to that as well. So, I mean, I think that dreams, considering we spend roughly a third of our lives asleep, the impact that dreaming must have on our daily life must be huge, and there's still so much to discover about that. So, yeah, I think dreams have always been very important to me, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you for giving me such personal insight. That's great. Do you believe that contact with the other side, albeit through dreams or ritual or artistic practice, is available to everyone? Or do you feel it's a calling, like we're born with it?
Good question. I don't know if I have the answer to that. I think that a lot of people have no interest in it. And if you have no interest in it, or if you feel that it's not for you or you're dismissive of it, then you're going to have massive blocks that obviously you won't ever get through. And there's no convincing people who feel like that. And also, it's their absolute right to feel like that. I know that when I was writing this book, I'd mention it to people, and some people would be a bit like, isn't that all a bit just woo woo and, a bit nonsensical? But it was very interesting for me, like looking more into the role of spiritualism in the 19th century and how many scientists were really interested in it at the same time. That because ideas around how we understand the world, how we understand time are expanding all the time. Scientists who are, at best, they're very creative beings because they're exploring things that maybe haven't been proved yet or haven't been uncovered. And so you have, scientists like Thomas Edison, for example, who very seriously tried to invent a telephone to call the other side. And you've got Marie Curie, who was really interested in ideas around the other side. You even get Einstein, who was very interested in ideas of that. Obviously, he's the great explorer of time, and he was very clear that there's a lot about time that we still don't understand. So, I think that if you're open to understanding or open to experiencing something you haven't experienced before, then I think that there will always be ways of accessing these worlds. But if you're deeply skeptical and have blocks, you'll never get there.
Yeah. Actually, you just reminded me as you were talking then that the height of spiritualism, so much was going on in science at that time. I think they were about to split the atom, or they do. I'm not sure what year exactly. They're starting to wonder how small things go. Can we split this and split that? And the infinitesimally small and large, and what's holding everything together, and realizing that there are unseen forces, whether we believe in it spiritually, religiously, or scientifically. We actually don't know. Or at the time, that when I read some of the literature from then, it's very driven, looking for answers, and there was a big push. It's just funny that one side of town we have artists channeling work, and the other we've got scientists or chemists or physicists asking almost the same questions.
Exactly, yeah, and I think, inventions like the X-ray were really important, I think, because it was this idea that if what was formerly unseen can now be seen, well, how does that impact on how we represent the world in terms of art? And you've got, as well as scientists being interested in ideas around spirituality, you've got artists who are really interested in science. So, for example, Hilma af Klint was fascinated by science, and she was always going to lectures and reading up about new scientific discoveries. And a lot of the artists around that time, there were big intersections actually with abstraction, developments in abstraction, radical developments in science, and also ideas around social change. And so you see that a lot of the women spiritualists were very involved also with ideas around female suffrage, about women getting the vote. Because we've got to remember, in the 19th century, women had no political agency anywhere.
Yeah.
And so a lot of them are aligned too with female suffrage. And spiritualism, in many ways, gave a lot of women a voice. It encouraged women to be vocal about what they'd experienced. It didn't discriminate in the main in terms of not only gender, but in terms of race and class as well. It was on the right side of history in terms of abolitionism of
Mm.
slavery in America.
Mm.
So it's, when I first got interested in this, I did have this sort of preconception of spiritualism being in this sort of ivory tower that was detached from the world. But actually, it was deeply embedded in, major social changes as well.
Yeah, and I suppose it sort of began in a grassroots kind of way. And also, as a movement, people may have been experiencing female leadership for the first time of larger
Yeah.
groups.
Hey, I mean, you've got Kate and Maggie Fox in America, you know, these
Yeah.
teenage girls who become very famous for their rapping. And, you know, their story is very complicated. You know, they very sadly died of alcoholism in their 50s. At one point, they denied their powers and they said that they were, you know, tricks. And then they again refuted that again. But whatever the story, they had a real power and they were very vocal on a lot of very fascinating stuff. And they were the sort of match that started the flame in a way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And then Hilma F. Clint goes to a lecture about Rosicrucianism, which is a subject close to my heart. And then Rudolf Steiner is involved in that, and then off Hilma goes to work immensely then for the next 4 decades. Yeah, when I start thinking about the immense amount of work produced, and it feels supernatural almost that she produced so much work, and she's documented 27,000 pages, did you say, on top of the artworks. It's incredible. It would have been nonstop.
Well, I mean, what's been interesting actually in the last few years is that it's sort of merging now that probably a lot more of her works than we realize were made collaboratively with fellow artists. And so it's possible that they were much more of a group effort than has been sort of previously understood. And there's a lot of scholarship happening around that. But actually, I'd love to ask you, Belle, about your interest in Rosicrucianism.
Sure.
Yeah.
I only really learnt about Rosicrucianism a couple of years ago when I was looking at how to improve and narrow my focus on mysticism and my studies. I've been interested all my life in these sorts of subjects, and I have a scattered approach. I pick up all sorts of books. My library is insane. It looks a little bit insane. And I'd read somewhere that someone I really respected said, "Oh, I joined the Rosicrucians for a while and I learned a lot from them." And I was like, "Oh, I'm going to do that." And I joined the Rosicrucians and became part of their learning program, their initiate program, and I've absolutely loved it. But I happened to do it around the same time of going back to university. So I had to put it on hold, and it's still on hold, but I'd found it fascinating, and it requires a fair bit of intellectual stamina actually, because we're going into ancient history and we're going forwards and sideways and upside down, and then the personal spiritual practice one has. And I have a history as a creative graphic designer and an artist, but by night for over 20 years I've worked as a psychic medium and a clairvoyant, which I've always had to keep very separate from my work until now, as I'm sort of getting more advanced in my career, and I'm like, I'm not going to keep them apart anymore. So this is why I was so blown away by your book. I'm like, oh, there's other women like me, psychic medium, artist, don't know why. It's always part of one thing. So I'm not an academic, but I guess part of my hobby is academically inclined, or I really love to study and understand more than practice these days. I want to know the history of everything. Yeah. And then there's the art that comes in over the top, like the icing.
Mm, mm. Really
That was a
fascinating.
long answer for you there, Jennifer. But yeah, I think I've got a future ahead of me studying the immense amount of information the Rosicrucians have to offer. I really like how they've laid out the learning process, and that's really what it is. It's a really great framework with all sorts of subject matter that obviously takes many stages and initiations. You can
Is
start
that why
right
you've
at the
got a
beginning.
rose at the bottom of your screen?
No, that's for a different reason. That's the marigolds.
It's a
There was,
marigold. Oh, I couldn't quite see.
yeah, it's sort of a marigold, as close as I could find that looked nice. I took a year off graphic design. I lived in Paris and worked in Paris for a few years, and I had a young family anyway. I came back to Australia and I was just super stressed out. And I decided to take a break, and I studied to become a horticulturalist. And I'd learned about marigolds and how you notice them getting planted in town centres and things like that in the gardens. I remember as a child or in Brisbane, and they actually clean the soil as a plant. They're like a purifier. I just really like this idea, and they're such a resilient flower, and I know that they have a lot of important meaning in different cultures as well around life and death and or the sun or longevity. Like, just it's become such an important flower through history, and I just feel attracted to it. I mean, there's many different meanings, but everywhere I look with a different interpretation of the marigold, I'm like, oh yeah, I'll buy that. That sounds really good.
Look into that. That sounds really interesting.
I love herbs and growing things, and it's sort of a big part of my life as well, is sort of this botanical aspect. So studying horticulture propelled me into starting to study landscape architecture, and that's where some of the foundational courses in that study took me to art history. And then I was on another trajectory, and yeah, so I've been chipping away at it years, and then I studied a bit of religion, and I've been zigzagging and sort of doing a DIY degree or two on what pleases me rather than to attain a goal. I just sounds actually hearing myself speak, I just really love studying. I think my head is full because it seems, I'm not sure if you ever get to this point of mental sort of saturation, but I can hardly recall any facts, but my head is full of stuff. Here's a big question. How do you see the future of art shaped by spiritual consciousness? Is there a new wave of visionary artists emerging today?
I mean, this relates back to the other answer. Spiritually inspired art now is more acceptable than it was maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So I think that we're in a really interesting period now where that different ways of representing the world in art are more acceptable. Given more institutional support, more critical support, more gallery support. So, I think that is encouraging people who may be keeping a little quiet about their interest in this stuff to sort of bloom. And, I'm seeing it more and more. I mean, I live in London, but I see more and more interest in this area and more examples of artists working in really interesting spiritualist ways from many different perspectives being shown. Yeah, I'm hopeful, definitely.
Yeah, I'm hopeful too. I think it's really fascinating. Okay, so this is a fun premise, but if you could bring one of the women you wrote about into our current cultural moment, who would it be? And what do you think she might say or create?
Oh, I think it'd have to be Hilma af Klint, just because she really was my sort of gateway into this world. I remember when I saw her major show at the Moderna Museet in Stockholm in 2013, I was so blown away by it. And it wasn't just the spiritualist stuff she made between 1906 and 1915 that she's most famous for, but it's also the stuff that she did to respond to, like, the growing militarization of Europe, for example, in the 1930s. She made really powerful work around that. I'd love her take on things now. I mean, there's a big debate raging around in the Hilma af Klint Foundation at the moment. It's slightly split. There is a certain movement within that foundation saying she should still only be shown within a spiritualist context, because she was quite insistent that her work should be seen in a certain way. And her work is, become much more commercial. I mean, I've seen like Hilma af Klint posters at IKEA. I think she would hate that, for example. Hilma af Klint socks in a museum show, which is just, I think, very disrespectful to what she was doing, because she really believed in the power of her work to be able to shift consciousness, so it was a very serious endeavor. So, but it would be very interesting if she was alive now and thinking about how she might be looking at the internet or digital art or communicating across, time and space using more mechanical means. I don't know. I'd be really fascinated to hear her perspective on things. And I think too, in terms of the world needing healing, I think it needs it more than ever, in terms of environmental destruction. And she was a brilliant ecologist. She was vegetarian at a time when it wasn't very common. So I think she'd have a lot of very interesting stuff to say.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting debate, actually, to take her work out of its spiritual context. And sounds like there's a layer of disrespect maybe in how the work is shown. If she was a specified religion and not just a spiritual person per se, I wonder if it'd be treated differently.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very big question. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But I'm sure we'll figure it out. And I'm sure there's more to be unearthed in her notes. But on the other hand, it's probably really important that, and perhaps I would imagine she would want as many people as possible to access her work.
Exactly.
Which in our current times requires a fair bit of commercialization and taking what you can get to get people to see things. So probably a fair split, pros and cons.
Absolutely.
Yeah. What does the phrase sacred mechanics evoke for you?
Yeah, I was thinking about that because I actually love the title of your podcast. I like its mix of the sort of esoteric and the utilitarian, the idea that this can be something that is hard to pin down, but there's mechanics to it. You can use it. There's a function. So yeah, I really like the sort of tension, contradiction, collaboration in the title. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, it's a very new show, but I think from time to time I will ask people that question because
Good question.
It's an interesting thing to, and I agree with you that there's a softness to it, but it is mechanical and there's an intangibility to it, just like art, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Jennifer, it's been absolutely a pleasure, and I'm honoured that you're on my brand new podcast. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Sacred Mechanics Podcast. I'm Belle Bear. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and stay up to date with us on social media or at sacredmechanics.com.